Okay, so continuing the conversation on how to look for cadences and do that analysis, follow the bass line. Because if you know that you have to end on these chords, right, there's very few notes in the bass that are going to support these harmonies. And sometimes you can literally follow that cello string bass line, and you can see it. You see this running part that goes to the dominant and holds. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Well, there's your half cadence, right? Mm-hmm. Or you see this running bass line that's kind of all over the place, and then all of a sudden, 5-1, rest.
Those will always be in root position.
You can have inversions of these chords.
Okay.
That would be an imperfect authentic cadence in this case. If you have 7-1, that's imperfect. If you have 2-3, mm-hmm. that's imperfect. Mm-hmm. Right? You ended up on a 1-6 chord. It is possible. It's kind of rare, but it is possible. Okay. To have these chords in inversion. But still, there's a limited number of scale degrees.
Yeah.
And the overall chord content still has to be a 5 chord resolving to a 1 chord, even if it's an inversion. Mm-hmm. Okay. You could end on an inversion of this chord, mm-hmm. right? But typically, these are actually root position chords, okay. In fact. And what makes an imperfect authentic cadence is not the inversion of these harmonies. Sometimes 7-1 or 2-1 mm-hmm. in the bass, mm-hmm. but still a root position tonic chord. Mm-hmm. But scale degree 3 or 5 in the soprano is what creates the imperfect authentic cadence, if that makes sense. Yeah. Another thing to bear in mind is that 1-6-4 really only does one thing, and that we had the lecture on the chords in inversion, is the cadential tonic 6-4 that resolves to 5-7 to create what is nearly always a perfect authentic cadence, this sort of sound. Right? So when 1-6-4 resolves to 5-7, that's a cadence. It's absolutely a cadence. Yeah. And there's no question. Mm-hmm. And so that progression actually can be very helpful. Oh, there's a 1-6-4 chord. This has to be a cadence. Mm. Because that's the function of the 1-6-4 chord.
It's always preceding what will be a cadence, because...
Yes. If that makes sense. I don't know if you may not have seen the second inversion, the 1-6-4, 4-6-4 video yet. That one's worth going back and looking at. I'll make sure you get that link.
Okay.
We'll check that again.
Okay.
But that is the role of the 1-6-4 chord. So if you see 1-6-4, then mm-hmm. you know that's a cadence. The only other exception is the Onward Christian Soldiers. Mm-hmm. Where's it go next? 5. Right? Mm-hmm. 1-6-4, 1. But that's just simply a bass line extending the tonic chord. You know what I mean? Yeah. That's the other use of the 1-6-4 chord, is simply just in a boom chick chick. Yeah. Which it's kind of substituting for the dominant chord at that point. It kind of creates that sense of, if that makes sense. Yeah. But anyway, but that's pretty rare. I mean, Onward Christian Soldiers is about the only. There's some others, but not many songs do that. Yeah. So nearly always a 1-6-4 chord. And if the 1-6-4 chord resolves to 5-7, that's a cadence. You can count on that. Okay? But the other thing to talk about, looking for very specific harmonies, because there are only 2 that support a cadence, and recognizing that the bass line will be shaped in such a way that the movement towards generally scale degree 5 or 5-1 itself is almost just apparent just looking at the bass line. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense. The other thing that tends to happen is that there's structural change at the moment of the cadence, particularly a perfect authentic cadence. Because if you think back to our form, perfect authentic cadences really do serve the purpose of bringing section 1, section 2, closing theme, coda, to a close. They are the periods of the sentences, right? Yeah. Of musical phrases. Yeah. And so if it's period, new sentence, mm-hmm. then invariably the musical material of the next sentence, next phrase, mm-hmm. It's different. It doesn't look the same, or it's a repetition of what we just heard. Does that make sense? And so, literally, particularly in full score, you know, the winds are just sitting there, and then all of a sudden play the melody. Okay? Well, if the moment they all of a sudden play the melody corresponds with a bass 5-1, right, and this is clearly that dominant chord resolving the tonic, well, that's probably a cadence.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we tend to see changes in musical elements moving forward. The accompaniment pattern changes, the melody changes, the rhythmic, often moving from section 1 to the transition. Section 1 often emphasizes division of the beat, quarter notes, eighth notes. The transition is the moment we get to the subdivision, 16th notes, right? And so visually, didn't get faster, but the note values reduced.
Yeah.
Right? The note values are quicker suddenly at the transition. And that's a dramatic difference in overall look. And then once we get to section 2, often the 16th notes dissipate and we're back to the 8th notes, quarter notes kind of, maybe. It's not that you can't have 16th notes within your expository melodies,
Sure.
but it's a rhythmic pattern that's more conducive to the purpose of the transition, probably, than the purpose of the expository phrases. But then again, once we get to the closing theme and terminative material, this may be another moment, particularly with repetition and such, to bring the 16th, the subdivision of the beat, the 16th notes back. You know?
Yeah.
And I mean, that's speaking in very general terms, and as many pieces would not do that as probably would. But if you have sort of certain expectations of what you're going to see, particularly in full orchestral scores, you'll see that usually the beginning of the transition is a moment that the full orchestra, all winds, begin playing. They might have added some color and maybe had the melody, maybe oboe had the opening melody with the violins or something. But suddenly all 4 woodwinds, all 4 brass, are right there at the transition.
Yeah.
And you can sort of think in your head orally why that would be, because that's the moment we're going to move and change keys. So we bring in everybody to do that, to have a very different timbre and texture than the opening expository section. So while students will struggle to find cadences correctly and sort of get this down, I think part of it is don't overthink it. There are very few harmonies that support a cadence. Therefore, there's very particular notes in the bass line that you're looking for. And if you follow the bass, you can almost figure out your cadence structure just looking at your bass line. But then visually, if the melody, the rhythm, the basic elements of music change, that's probably coinciding, not always, but probably coinciding with a cadence.
Yeah.
But even still, there's moments for debate. The fact that cadences can be covered, they can be extended, they can be elided, they can be delayed. There's ways to manipulate the moment of cadence to sort of obscure it.
Yeah.
And sort of. So while we talk about the end of a phrase being a moment of repose, the musical material coming to some sort of conclusion, the conclusion itself can be hit and then just kind of move in sort of sweeping motion forward, and we didn't quite get the sense that was it didn't cadence rhythmically, but it did cadence in terms of melody, in terms of harmony, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But again, in doing sonata form analysis, you are also starting with this presupposition. If this is in sonata form, and I can tell you 332 is, then I'm looking, and of course this is where that one's going to get a little dicey, but I'm looking for non-modulating periodic structure typically. And I'll go ahead and warn you, the trick with 332 is the opening material actually is not as clearly periodic.
Yeah.
One might argue it's really just a group of phrases with perfect authentic cadences in the tonic key. He somehow manages to just present these ideas without half cadences. So it's like, here's a couple phrases in F that aren't necessarily periodic, but they're thematic, they serve the purpose of section 1. That's the trick to that one, I'll go ahead and warn you. So if you're looking for an outright period in the opening, you're a little disappointed because it doesn't seem to be playing fair. But there's clearly the moment it begins to modulate.
Yeah.
So there's no question that this one phrase into it a bit is the beginning of the transition. Well, if you've identified the transitional phrase, that which precedes it is section 1, and one would assume that's in periodic structure, but if in the case of 332 it wasn't, it was just a group of perfect authentic cadences, well, it's still section 1 because there's nothing else to call it. It just didn't happen to be periodic, which I would have expected, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so sometimes what I tell students is actually look for the transition first. And again, if it modulates, there should be accidentals.
Yeah.
Almost without exception. Sometimes the modulation from minor to relative major can sneak by without the accidentals you thought you might see, because the key signature for the minor and the relative major is identical. Therefore, we don't necessarily need the same set of accidentals or a new set of accidentals.
Right.
That's the one kind of. But I'll tell you, even in that case, you're liable to see some secondary dominance, some accidentals sneak in regardless. I would challenge you to write a convincing transition that modulates from the relative minor to the relative major. It can be done, but it's a challenge that actually doesn't use a single accidental. You can do it, but it may not be as convincing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, you would expect we're moving along and then all of a sudden we hit accidentals. Well, that's your transition. So now I just need to identify where, before all those accidentals began showing up, was the actual cadence that splits section 1 from the transition.
Yeah.
Recognizing it might, if it's Beethoven, it might be dependent transition, which is a little bit, is a little more muddy than if it were independent transition. But even then, that's understandable. We can figure out what that looks like. If that makes sense.
Yep.
And then finding the moment that the new theme in the new key begins generally is all but impossible to miss simply by listening to the piece. That's a pretty important moment. We've heard a theme, now we've transitioned, and now we have a new melody in the new key. That moment usually is not obscured in any way. It's, here's a brand new melody, right, in our new key. And we have this sense of arrival. We have this sense of, now it's a pretty melody.
Yeah.
Often, not always, but Beethoven will do this. Often his opening theme will be very dramatic and have this, sort of intense sense of energy about it. If you look like at Beethoven's Fifth, it's a motive, it's not a thematic, you're not going da 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 da. I mean, you're not, you'll hear that in your head, but it's not all that singable.
Right.
And then we go through the transition and we get da da dee da dee da dee dum for the second theme.
Yeah.
Well, the second theme is suddenly it's much more melodic, it's more singable. Beethoven, that's almost a characteristic of Beethoven, is that the second theme is your true sort of singable melody and has this moment of sort of almost peaceful resolve in contrast to the tempest sort of energy that it opened up with. And so that moment is felt as that, and you're not going to miss it. So section 2, is probably not all that difficult to discern. And then now you're looking for periodic phrasing or double period, and the perfect authentic cadence is the beginning of your terminative material. And then the elided perfect authentic cadences are mocking off a series of phrases that are simply named, accordingly based on how many there are. So while it's a ton of information, and I appreciate, it's not at first seemingly the easiest thing to do. It's one of those things, once you kind of get it down, it's a pretty straightforward pattern.
Yeah.
Weird time, somebody stepped there.